Okay, let's pull back together now. One of the things I was talking to some of the Synchronous Life students earlier about was I'm going to go ahead and modify question 5 on the week 4 quiz. So everybody, if you missed it, that'll be corrected. It was just a little bit ambiguously written because of me. It was my fault. So we're going to update that. If you're still taking the quiz or haven't taken the quiz, we'll just change the question and make it a little more clear so it doesn't throw anybody off. And occasionally I do write a really bizarre question. I don't know why. It's just the way I'm wired, and I need to do a better job of that. So thank you for your patience with that. Let's talk about the problem. One of the things that Israel would have wanted to know before they get to the Promised Land was why are the things the way they are? So we ask this question too. Why pain? Why suffering in the world? Why is there violence? Why are there wars? Why are there hurricanes? These are the kinds of things that we ask. And what Moses is going to do is unpack a little bit of that in the early chapters of Genesis here in 1 through 11. It's one of the theological lessons that I think is important to him because not only does he introduce it in Genesis 3, but he also unpacks it with regards to the flood account, which we'll get to a little bit. And finally, he wraps it all up with one more account of rebellion, and that's the Tower of Babel episode. So all of this, you might say that almost from chapter 3 onward, it's all focusing on the unwinding of the implications for rebellion. And what does rebellion look like? That's important for Israel because they want to be just the opposite. They don't want to be in that category of building for themselves a name. That's not something Israel should be about doing. They should be bearing the name Yahweh, not building and making their own flag to plant. So that's an important lesson for Israel to learn. So let's get into the theology of rebellion. So this will be the fourth lesson, the fourth big lesson. How many of you ever have been in a ministry situation where you've tried to minister to someone who's gone through a spat with suffering? Suffering is a big idea, right? Especially more recently for you. People are experiencing prolonged illnesses. Suffering could come at the hands of natural disasters, of course, but financial disasters that happen. People, get to the end of their rope with regards to something, and their world caves in, and they're asking the real live nerve, right, type questions. So this gets into this is an important thing. At least it lays a foundation for helping us understand. I hope I'll address some of these things. But the pre-fall commands for Adam, as we saw, the original list, multiply, fill, rule, subdue. I added eat and don't eat. So you have this basic framework. I think Adam was commanded, and Israel would have understood Adam's role is to follow through with these commands as an offshoot of his ability to properly represent the name Yahweh through his bearing the image of God. And so wherever they go, as they continue to expand and fan out, and this is basically a project of name expansion or reputation expansion. Where Adam goes, where humanity goes, walking in obedience, people should watch and observe and say, I want to know the name of their God. Who are they worshiping? What they're doing is radically different than anybody else around. We're worshiping our gods, but they're talking about one God. We're over here experiencing half a famine, and their crops always come in on time. What's going on over there is kind of the thing. And let's just keep moving on. So eventually what happens that we see, and we talked about the interruption in chapter 3, all of a sudden there's one who shows up who's already experienced his rebellion and the consequences of his rebellion, namely the devil, and he's going to try to turn this thing upside down. with his ploy to bring about rebellion and incite rebellion in Adam and Eve. He's not about wanting to promote and see any name building, any name of Yahweh building on planet Earth. So this becomes the satanic deception. I think, come let us make for ourselves a name. And this is basically the foundation for the rebellious theological trajectory. If we make for ourselves a name, we are misrepresenting the name of Yahweh with our activity, and thus we're destroying or totally disregarding the name of Yahweh through our rebellion. So, I mean, this is an important a lesson later. We can turn to some of the more specific teaching that Moses gives Israel. Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 5, and a couple places there I list. Actually, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 12. That's a significant... What's interesting about this is that you see the initial theological foundation laid in the earlier chapters of the Pentateuch, and then what you have later on is Moses unpacking even more implications for these early lessons. So here he is, the laws of the sanctuary, chapter 12, verse 5, for example. But you shall seek the Lord Yahweh at the place which the Lord your God shall choose from all your tribes to establish his what? His name there, his reputation. For there will be his dwelling, and there you shall come. So now it's woven into the very fabric of Israel's worship. It's going to be at an authorized location where the Lord himself will choose to establish his name. That means through Israel's worship and where they go to make and involve themselves by faith in the sacrificial system to deal with sin. It's all to magnify the name and reputation of Yahweh. It's covenant expression. So, but what we have is this battle that we're going to see. As I said and made the case last week, paganism and all of its very forms. It's the devil's agenda to confuse, to redefine, and to disrupt the name-building enterprise, the name-building activity that we have from the early parts of Genesis 1. So this is the problem for Israel. Israel's understanding, here's what we're getting ourselves into. This is why it's important to establish the name of Yahweh. So we're not misrepresenting his name. And according to one of the Ten Commandments, we're not taking the Lord's name in vain, right? There it is again, front and center in the expanded version of the 10. One of them is don't misrepresent his name. Not just about cussing and swearing, about the full package, down to the level of what we do and how we express ourselves, the details of our daily life is how we represent the name, or take the name of the Lord in vain. So that's what we can say about that. So what happens? Let's take a look at some of the aftermath of the fall in Genesis 3. And I'm turning now over to the poetic section here, beginning in verse 14. So now we have the introduction of, really we've got three guilty parties. The devil or the snake, we have Eve, and then Adam. And what I want to focus on this slide is just this idea of futility. Futility. And you see it in how the Lord responds to the rebellion of the first humans. And the first aspect of futility will be directed at the devil. Let's have Christopher over here. Could you read for us in verse 14 through 15?
Which
chapter 3.
Which book, sorry?
We're in Genesis. Got it? Okay. Read loud too, so everybody can hear us. 14 and 15, yeah.
Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you more than all cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel.
Okay, let's just pause there. So now we've got a response, a divine response to the devil's agenda. And notice what happens. There's going to be this introduction of futility against the devil while he's roaming around on planet Earth. But notice verse 15. That's kind of an important idea. There's going to be conflict with humanity. And specifically, in 15b, you've got this unnamed he, this third masculine singular pronoun in the Hebrew. Who is this he? Yeah, there's going to be one who comes from the seed of the woman, as it's said here in verse 15. And this particular he, this person, when he comes on the scene, he'll have an agenda. So his agenda will be to extend bruising to the devil's head, but in the process, he himself will be bruised on the heel. That's interesting. Now we have the beginnings of the gospel. We have the what is it called? It's a fancy word. I always say it wrong. Can anybody say it right? Yes, proto-evangelion. I always forget the Gillian part. Yes, it's the proto-evangelism. The first reference to the divine solution to the rebellion of humanity now is identified. So from this point on in the text, and for Israel, right, they would understand, when is this he going to come on the scene? We're waiting. And that's going to give us information, so when we get to a prophet like Isaiah, who in chapter 53 is going to have a vision of the suffering of this he, in more details, one will come and suffer on behalf of humanity for the sins of humanity. And we start to have this fuller picture of the coming cross, and this becomes a theological thread beginning here. But another thing I want to show and focus on is how this futility is extended to Eve and to Adam. Not in every detail of life. I think we just have kind of a representation or a short list, but to the woman in verse 16, we're going to have two examples: pain and childbirth in verse 16, and then what I would call kind of a conflict with her mate. This idea of conflict within humanity. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule, he shall rule over you. So there's going to be conflict in the rulership or the headship model, perhaps there. And then to Adam, verse 17. Now we've got more details given with regards to this introduction of futility, pointed now at Adam. Cursed is the ground because of you, and toil. You're going to have to work for your food. You're going to have to plow the ground all the days of your life. But you're going to have to fight against certain things that are going to grow up against you, thorns and thistles. You'll have to eat of the plants of the field. You'll sweat, verse 19. You'll eat bread, but you'll have to bake it till you return to the ground. You'll toil your whole life, and you'll have to work because of this. So that's what it means to be exiled from the garden. You're going to be introduced to this idea of futility. Outside of the boundaries of the garden, angels standing at the gate, no entrance. You're going to have to go out, and this is going to be futility and how one expresses. You're still commanded to fill, multiply, rule, and subdue. But all of these will be met with some kind of pushback. So what's interesting about that? Let me go and connect this idea to what Paul talks about in Romans chapter 8. Let's talk about this a little bit. So this is futility. Everybody got the idea of futility? It's this general low-grade frustration with it. You turn every corner in life, and life always seems to be pushing back at you. You build a house in Houston, and all of a sudden something comes and knocks it down. That's an example of this is the kind of futility that happens. And then we can get into debate after that. But here's what I want us to see. Let's turn to Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. Paul is talking about this, and he's got a lot of people around him who are experiencing suffering at the hand of the Romans, perhaps persecution and things like that were a live nerve for the body of Christ at that time in the first century church. He's trying to encourage his audience, just like Moses is trying to encourage and prepare his audience as well. But let's move over to chapter 8. Let's start reading here in verse 15. For you have not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons, by which we cry out, Abba, Father. There's an intimacy there. We're part of a family. We've got a father. This is a family discussion Paul's having. And he continues on, verse 16. The capital S Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. You know when you're in the family of God. And what's true if you're in the family of God, verse 17. And if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ. That's good. But look, if indeed we suffer with him. Why? In order that we may also be glorified with him. Paul says, as a result, therefore, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the anxious longing of creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was, here it is, subjected to futility, not of its own will, but because of capital H, him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God, which will be our future experience. But until then, Paul says, let me encourage you. Suffering is a way, or at least one way. Here's my thesis. It's like, you can disagree with me on this if you want to. But it appears to be God's way of getting glory out of a fallen world. Suffering, the suffering of the saints, the suffering of the children of God leads to glory. It produces glory. Paul says that it would be a glory that one day will be revealed to us. Glory, what is glory? It's this, I call it the currency of eternity. That's one way to think about it. Glory is that thing which God is desiring. It seems to be somewhat mysterious in the way that it's something that we produce and give to him that he doesn't already have. Glory to God. And it's through our suffering and how we respond to this futility that seems to be part of the equation for us as we move through and navigate through hurricanes, as we move through and navigate through long-term illnesses, conflict on the job, broken relationships, and all those kinds of things that produce suffering in our lives. There's a mystery there. C.S. Lewis wrote, you're probably familiar with his quote, suffering is God's megaphone, he said. It either drives us away from him, or it pushes us or increases our dependence more on God. It's kind of a rephrase there from me. But this is kind of a way to get at it. And then it's not until Romans 8:28, for God works all things for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. Well, we cannot detach, for Paul in Romans 8, part of the purpose for which we've been called seems to be, as a children, as part of the family of God, is to encounter suffering. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here, and trying to understand Paul a little bit and make Paul and connect Paul to Moses in terms of the Old Testament, and trying to understand this is a world that's been subjected to futility. We look out the window, we can help people understand that. People come to us with questions, we need to have answers and to help them understand. Well, rebellion happened, and the world is the way it is. And God has injected futility into the world to bring about an experience, sometimes, not all the time, but of adversity. And it's at this adversity that we're always responding to, and sometimes it creates suffering for the Christian. Let's turn to, I like that picture. One of the things that I want to turn to now is, and connect. Well, go ahead.
I
Yeah.
just have a quick question.
Yeah.
When you read verse 20, did you say capital H, him?
In the New American Standard, we'll typically put a capital letter when it's referring to God or deity.
So why is it in Genesis that there's no capital there?
No, in my translation, Yeah, he shall, capital H, he shall bruise you on the heel. So it's,
King James Version, it has it.
in what verse?
The King James Version
Of,
of Genesis that we just read.
it shall bruise you on the heel?
That's what mine has.
Wow. Well, a third masculine pronoun can be he, or if it's not, it could be it. But I think in the context where we see that this is focusing on this, it's a matter of the one who would come forth from the seed of humanity, or woman, eventually to become the one who would take care of the problem. It's pointing ahead to the capital H, he, and eventually we'll figure out who he is, kind of thing. So there's an anticipation.
Well, I think that it was referring to the seed, so it's
Oh.
antecedent as the seed.
Okay.
In 3:15.
It shall.
What it refers to as the seed, which is going to be.
Yeah. Well. Okay. Well, that's a good question. Let's turn now to Job and try to understand this a little bit more. Because Job asked a pretty significant question. And the reason I go to Job at this point is because for Job, we have a very similar context for his suffering. The book of Job is a book that's one part of the wisdom books that the entire book addresses the one question: what about righteous suffering? Right? It addresses suffering in the person of Job and his personal experience. The bulk of the book is about his feedback, the advice he gets from his 4 friends. Finally, he hears from the Lord at the end. But in the important early chapters, we have him losing things and experiencing and grieving over loss. Loved ones, he loses them. He loses some of the benefits of his household. The business that he's established for him and his family is gone. So he's grieving. And to be fair to his wife, she's grieving too. So we can't be so hard on her for asking this question. And in the midst of grief, she says in chapter 2, verse 9, Job, honey, husband, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. You might expect that from someone who's grieving. It's a raw nerve. It's a real emotion. That's what we have in God's Word multiple times. This is a couple that's grieving loss, and he says, in an important question on verse 10, but he says to her, you speak as a foolish woman speaks. But here's his question: shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept, there's that word, adversity. That's the word that goes back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, bad, or adversity. Sometimes I like to keep track of the possible range of meaning for those words, because as soon as you're eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and adversity, guess what happens? It's going to be your experience. This pushback, the experience of the futility, or here what's being, I think, caught in the question of Job. And it's interesting that that Satan has the same agenda here for Job as he did for Adam and Eve. It's interesting how Job responds to the question, or the real situation in his life. Man, how am I supposed to respond to this? Can I only accept good from God and not adversity? It's an interesting question. How he responds is kind of a foundation for us who are in counseling ministry and the kind of thing. What Job does do through this is he properly grieves, and his friends come to him and they're silent for a whole week before saying anything. I think that speaks a lot to how we should approach the situation and helping people around us who are in need of help, who are having the experience of adversity, who have some situation where they're suffering. The question is, sometimes we have adversity. How do we respond to it? It's not that God has given up on us. That's never the answer from any of the authors of the Old Testament. But sometimes there's a waiting. Sometimes we have to be like, let's close the loop on this. Let's turn over to Ecclesiastes really quick here, which is another book that's interesting. I'm sorry, Lamentations. I said Ecclesiastes. There's actually an account in Ecclesiastes, but Lamentations chapter 3. This is another book that was, I think, intended for a group of people who were grieving. In this case, the loss of land. They were in exile. They've lost their king. They've lost their temple. And this person in chapter 3, I think it's Jeremiah, he's pouring out his heart. He's writing this down in this poetic parallelism, and he's got something that he's going to hand off to the exiles who are in Babylon, helping them work through their situation and how they respond to the fact that they've lost everything. They've ceased to exist as a nation. And you get to the end of chapter 3, and you hear the complaining. I've become a laughing stock to all my people. Their mocking song all the day. He's filled me with bitterness. He's made me drunk with wormwood or bitterness, and he's broken my teeth with gravel. He's made me cower in the dust, and my soul's been rejected from peace. I've forgotten happiness, so I say, my strength is perished, and so has my hope from the Lord. Just got to read it with a little drama. But then there's a pause, and the same author comes back with verse 19. But remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. The bowed soul responding in the midst of adversity. That's the secret. This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I have hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the person who seeks him. It's good that he waits silently, for salvation is of the Lord. And then notice the question that he asks a little further down in that chapter, down in verse 38. Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that both good and adversity, or ill or bad, go forth? He asked the same question as Job. So it's that commonality. I think the biblical authors, they all have to reflect on this surreal situation that futility has been injected in to now the working order of things, because it's judgment. And it's for a time, but not forever. And as believers, as one who are walking by faith, we have to recognize that for what it is. God is not the author of evil. We have to be careful about our terminology. God seems to have introduced us to the potential for experience of futility and adversity. That's true. And he's doing that in response to the general response of rebellion across humanity. And for Moses, it's a live wire as we continue into chapter 4, and we have the whole account of Cain and Abel. We have our first incident of fratricide, brother killing brother, right? So right away we dive right into what's this thing look like now that it's spiraling out of control, the cycle of rebellion. I just want to make sure I give Dr. Allen credit. Maybe you were in chapel when he gave probably one of his first chapel addresses after he lost his wife when she died, and he came in chapel and he says there's glory in the stars and the scars. Remember that chapel message that he gave? You should go watch it. He came in and talked about suffering. And here he's standing in front of the whole school after losing his wife, Sherry. The cycle of rebellion continues. So how does this cycle move ahead? Like I mentioned in chapter 4, excuse me, we've got the conflict between two brothers, Cain and Abel. Like Adam from the garden, Cain himself, as a response, will experience exile. But then we have a little bit of some interesting things showing up in chapter 4, beginning in verse 16. We have a continuation of the genealogy of Adam. Chapter 4, beginning in verse 25. That's where I wanted to go. So we have a continuation of the godly line. Adam had relations with his wife. She gave birth to a son and named him Seth, where she said, God's appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. And to Seth, to him also a son was born, and he called him Enosh. And as man or humanity began to continue to multiply, fill, multiply, rule, and subdue, what else did they do? They began to continue to call upon the name of Yahweh, the name of the Lord. So there's some indicators or markers that Moses gives us that this is a godly line. This is the line that's spreading out. And from this godly line, I think that's part of the theology of the genealogies that we read later. The author's keeping track for us of where this godly line goes as it eventually gets us to the Messiah. So I think that's certainly one of the theological reasons that we have these long lists of who's related to who in the Old Testament as one of the purposes for them. Eventually we connect to David, and then we eventually connect to Christ. So in verse 26, the godly line will be hopefully intent on properly representing the name or the reputation of Yahweh as they continue to fan out. They call on the name of the Lord. I don't think this is a contradiction with what we read in Exodus chapter 6, verses 3. Let's turn there really quick just to settle this one. Exodus chapter 6. Some debate over this, but Exodus chapter 6, verses 3. See, Moses is having his personal revelation moment from the Lord. In verse 2, Elohim, capital G-O-D, spoke further to Moses and says to him, I am Yahweh, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. That's how the New American Standard keeps track of God, or Elohim versus Yahweh. And I also appeared, by the way, Moses, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, as El Shaddai, God Almighty, but by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them, and I established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan in the land which they sojourned. Now, at first read, that sounds like a contradiction, and you may hear that, but I think what we have here is that what we have to keep track of is the fullness of the revelation of everything that the name Yahweh means was not fully revealed to Abraham and the patriarchs, and even the further patriarchs before Abraham that we just read about in the genealogy, calling on the name of the Lord. So there's this progress of revelation. The fullness of Yahweh, I think, is intended for, well, I think there's a progression even beyond Sinai, but the fullness of what it means. I mean, God introduces himself to Israel by name at Mount Sinai. And I think Moses is just helping us to understand the fullness of what that name meant or means to Israel was not fully revealed to Abraham, but was more fully revealed to them at Mount Sinai. So that's kind of, I think, what's going on there. All right, so let's talk about the cycle of rebellion. Go ahead.
Yeah, you said God is not the author of evil. I agree with you.
Good.
But I've been in a class, in a Sunday school class, and someone referred us to Isaiah 45:7, where it was stated that I formed the light and created darkness. I made peace and create. It just says I create evil.
Where's this? Isaiah
45:7.
Isaiah 45:7.
Yes.
It's the same word, Ra.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the same Hebrew word that could be translated evil, bad, or adversity, or in this case, my New American Standard, calamity. Just the same basic idea. So, causing well-being.
How do we now defend that? Because it said that I, the Lord, do all these things.
Yeah. Well, evil, God's not the creator or source of evil, but he did introduce futility into creation, according to Paul in Romans 8:20, which is an entirely different category of idea than evil. Evil comes with, you could say Satan. He had his fall, Satan's agenda in establishing false religions, paganism, all those pagan practices that stem from evil. Those things find their permanent residence on planet Earth, but God's not the author of evil. He establishes good in creation. Creation is created good in a sense of how it functions for humanity as a place to live, and it's the domain in which we, as human beings, express that God-given design, the initial commands to fill, multiply, rule, and subdue, and fan out from there. So God's not the author of evil. See, I have to be careful about, how I interpret the one Hebrew word ra. Evil, bad, calamity, or adversity or hardship. Yeah, all of that. You just have to be careful. And context is really our guide. So we have to allow the authors to use these Hebrew words, but in their context, there may be in a context where they're addressing judgment, right? And something that needs to be, seriously considered by their audience. I think this might be a reminder. Well, let's see here. I'd have to look at the broader context, but Isaiah is probably focusing on God's ability to turn up the amplification to the futility knob of judgment as a wake-up call for a rebellious group, which at that time would have been in the majority of Israel. So, all right, well, let's keep going here. After the brief, now we're back to Genesis. We're going to eventually start picking up some steam here, but some of these early chapters are pretty theologically rich, so I just wanted to slow down a bit for today's sake. After the genealogy in chapter 5, what we have in chapter 6 now is a continual unpacking of this rebel theme, the rebellion of humanity. And this is how I want us to set the context for the much discussed, the much debated Nephilim section of the Old Testament. Because I think it helps us to understand who the Nephilim are if we are still riding on this wave of what Moses is doing here and helping us to understand humanity's rebellion and where it's going. So that's my little thesis. Because what we have going on here now, and in what we've seen, I would argue, is this focus on all of the activity before anybody gets to the promised land. Abraham eventually, at the end of chapter 11, will be called from this area of the country in red, Mesopotamia, Tigris, Euphrates River Valley, the cradle of humanity. But what we'll see here in these early chapters, I think the activity is still going on there. So these next two big examples of rebellion that we have, really here's how I describe it. The center of gravity, or the bullseye or target for God's judgment that comes against the examples of human rebellion is right here in this part, this land. It's important that I say that now. This is the land where it's taking place, and from the vantage point of Moses, he's looking there to say, here's what's happening, here's where it's happening on planet Earth, and that's how we, I think, have to approach it. So let's move to Genesis 6, and I want to make some comparisons between what we've already read. And this is kind of like interpretation. So if you look at the beginning of chapter 6, and now it came about when humanity, began to multiply, which is what they're supposed to do, on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. What did they do? That the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, there's a distinction, were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. So you might say the first verse there describes the activity of what's going on. So far, so good. Here's what I would argue, and I want to point out here in this slide, there's similarity in language. So this is rebellion. You see the similar language. When the woman saw, the sons of God saw that the tree was good, that the daughters of men were, the Hebrew word is good. It's translated beautiful in your context, but it's just the same word, good. She took from the fruit, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. I think there's some intentionality here. Moses is giving us a little echo back, but this is a rebellion context because of the similar language. And what we see here is the judgment. How does God respond to this rebellion? Verse 3, then the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he's also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. I think that's a reference to basically the judgment of putting a hard wire in the program to limit the general longevity of how long humanity is allowed to live on planet Earth. So that's how I interpret that. So that's a judgment context. 120 years is about 3 generations, and then they die. So this is limiting, in a way, maybe the lifespan of how long can a rebellious person live, or something like that. And then we have a break in the narrative in verse 4. In Hebrew, this would be kind of like, I call this an oh, by the way clause to make it simple. It's a break in the narrative, and it kind of separates what we just read in verses 1 through 3 to what we're about to read next. So that's the way I interpret the first part. Really, verses 1 through 3 are a self-contained unpacking of what Moses just identifies. The sons of God, I would argue, are not angels. My approach to that is that they are part. They're identified. This is a focus on the godly line, the sons of God, and who should the godly line be involved in taking wives for themselves? They should be taking wives from the daughters of God, the godly line, the female part or expression of the godly line, not taking for themselves daughters from the sons of men or whoever. There's a breach in, there's a violation there that I think is what's going on here. Otherwise, I'm stuck in a position of trying to interpret and understand what does it mean for angels to be taking wives for themselves. Angels, were they ever designed and created to have sex, to procreate? No. That just seems really odd and awkward. So you can see, this is not an issue to break a church up over, but I'm just giving you my understanding because I think it's comprehensive, and let's just keep going here. So now, in verse 4, I see a narrative break. And then Moses says, and oh, by the way, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, that is, the same days as the situation I just described, and also afterward when the sons of God were in the activity of coming into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those, that is, the Nephilim, were the mighty men who were of old, and here's how it should be translated, men of, what do you got? No, it's the Hebrew word that means name. Men of name. It's the same, I think it's the same idea that we've been already talking about. These Nephilim are about name building for themselves. They're men of whose name? You could add to it their own name. Not the name Yahweh, but the name of them. They're name building for themselves. They're men of name. Well, whose name? Not the Lord's. So this Nephilim. Now let me unpack the Nephilim a little bit more. Who are the Nephilim? I think Moses may give us the answer. And we have to look at the whole Pentateuch in order to understand more about the Nephilim. I haven't fully answered who I think the Nephilim are yet, but I'm not looking at the Nephilim as rock people or fallen angels having sex with humans. None of that falls into my category of making sense. I have a better explanation. Are you ready? All right, so Nephilim actually come up in Moses' own writing later on in the Pentateuch. Let's take a look at chapter 2 in Deuteronomy and unpack this mystery once and for all. Deuteronomy chapter 2. Again, this is in my P bucket. I'm not going to break fellowship over this with any of you if you disagree with me. But I know a lot of you have probably been given ideas about the Nephilim. You've had strong, passionate conference speakers coming to your church giving weekend seminars on who the Nephilim are. All of the above. I know. There's books on this shelf, even in secular bookstores. The Secret of the Nephilim. There's been documentaries on Netflix that you can watch on who the Nephilim are. All these different ideas, and Hollywood's version and all of that. Deuteronomy chapter 2. Moses says in verse 10, the Emim lived there the Emim lived there formerly, a people as great, numerous, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also regarded as Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Emim. Now, let's just keep track of that for a second. Moses is referring to Emim, Rephaim, and the Anakim, all referring to a kind of a general, different ways of looking into this group of people who are seemingly tall and intimidating. They seem to be always standing in the way of God's agenda advancing. Now, let me qualify that, and let's turn to Numbers. Let's turn back to Numbers chapter 13. And here's the context of, and a familiar context here of the spy report. When Israel had their first opportunity to go into the Promised Land, they sent in spies and the report back. And what Moses has here in verse 33 in chapter 13, there also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our sight, and so we were in their sight. So here's this, refers to the Anakim, which we saw in the previous Deuteronomy 2 chapter. Anakim and Nephilim here are linked. Everybody see the connection there? The continuity is that the Nephilim, like the Anakim, are tall and mean and intimidating. And there they are standing in opposition, opposing God's agenda. The what next? They're intimidating God's people. Now, let's turn over to Joshua. Joshua chapter 11, verse 22. Okay. Joshua chapter 11, verse 22. And here we have Joshua writing, I would argue, there were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod some remain. These are Philistine cities along the Mediterranean Sea coast, but on the border of the Promised Land. And here you have the reference to the Anakim as being related. Sorry, I've lost my place here. The Anakim were, some of them were left over in some of these Philistine cities, only in Gaza and in Gath and in Ashdod. Well, that's interesting. Let's turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 7. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Sorry. 1 Samuel chapter 17. And this isn't a familiar passage. David and Goliath. Chapter 17, verse 4. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Here he is, Mr. Tall, mean, and intimidating. Intimidating what? God's agenda for the what next for God's people. That's pretty much in continuity with everything that we've seen before. So what am I saying by all of this? Who are the Nephilim, though, in chapter 6? Here's what I have to say. Trying to allow, in this case, Scripture to interpret Scripture, I can't build a case for, the angels. That doesn't make sense. Goliath seems to be genetically connected to this line of Nephilim that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 6. So what I'm arguing for is something that might be closely associated, not necessarily in Moses' eyes, but somehow a hereditary propensity to being part of the Nephilim. It's, in other words, I would say from this side of science, maybe hardwired into the rebellious side of how the DNA works. This is a strain that follows through humanity, and it shows up and rears its ugly head at various times in history, because all of these references to the Nephilim are post-flood. I don't know if you caught that or not. So even past the ark, and anybody gets off the ark, Nephilim are continually showing up. And I think that's because it's woven into the rebellious impact of the fall. And by the way, the term Nephilim in Hebrew means fallen ones. So I think that's part of the naming strategy that Moses has here. So the Nephilim of Genesis 6 represent a particularly intense expression of the fall of humanity. They express, it might be this even a genetic defect with this tendency towards giantism. It's part of I would argue, that's why I kind of think of the DNA impact. These guys show up, maybe even gals show up later in history with this propensity to be tall, mean, and intimidating as an expression of the fallenness of humanity. Kind of a concentrated expression for the fallenness of humanity. They are bent against the establishment of the name of Yahweh. They are all about the establishment of their own name and their own reputation. Thus, I go back to the naming of the Nephilim, men of name. So that's part of their agenda, their rebellious agenda. And like I said, I think it's just a way for Moses to identify they're the Nephilim again. There they are, showing up tall, mean, and intimidating, and contrary and opposed to the divine agenda for the expression of a name-bearing responsibility of humanity. Yeah.
Do you have a thought as to why it doesn't say the sons of men and the sons of daughters? Why it says sons of God and daughters of men?
Yeah, the sons of God would be Moses' way of putting emphasis on that. How do I say this? I'm losing my thought here. The holy seed, the holy, the godly line, the godly line that's
created.
the godly line. Pardon?
That's
Yeah. Part of the continuity of the godly line, that part of humanity with the higher calling responsibility of bearing that name and reputation of Yahweh, all the way up through who is the He from Genesis 3 going to be, that seed. And they don't need to be messing around with we would say, the genetics or the DNA of the seed. That's a preservation of the holiness of that responsibility, that godly line is to carry that seed all the way up to the Messiah. And so this rebellion is putting all of that in jeopardy, I would say. There's not enough I wish there was more in the text to go on with that, but it's the best I can do. Yeah. All right. So now what we do is we set ourselves up with our next break. So let our minds rest a little bit. Let's try to take maybe a 5 to 6 minute break and get back for the home stretch, okay? Let's do that. If you have any particular questions,